Are you working with a service provider or a supplier that is failing to provide service or consistent quality product? Are they a person you've dealt with for years, or you're friendly with, or just a nice person you don't want to end the business relationship with? But for your business and its success, it may be necessary to end that relationship. Well, in today's episode of the FAQ Business Podcast, I, your host, Jane Tweedy, will be going through exactly this: whether or not it is time to fire that service provider or that supplier, and if so, how to go about it. Welcome to the FAQ Business Podcast for business owners, covering 4 pillars: actionable education, inspiring leaders, businesses like you, and thought leadership, where we challenge your thinking. Hosted by myself, Jane Tweedy, I'm founder and lead trainer of FAQ Business Training, where we want to avoid you getting ripped off or ripping yourself off. We'll feature an amazing diversity of guests with lots to educate and inspire you. Let's jump into today's episode of the FAQ Business Podcast. Welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of the FAQ Business Podcast. Today's episode has come about through recent discussions with clients and is something that rears its head quite regularly. This episode fits under the pillars of thought leadership and actionable education, and is brought to you today by myself, founder and lead trainer of FAQ Business Training and host of the FAQ Business Podcast, Jane Tweedy. You'll be able to access a copy of a free download of the Change Your Service Provider checklist from our blog attached to this episode. In one recent example, a client asked me to meet with her to change her employees to contractors, which I thought was a little odd. When querying it a little bit further, it turned out she thought this might be a way to save her bookkeeping money because her business had reduced. And I asked how much she was paying the bookkeeper, and did a little bit of quick research online as to what other local bookkeepers might be charging for the same type of service. Turned out she was paying on a weekly basis what many were charging on a monthly basis. Now that could have been justified, but what was worse in her situation, you'd expect great service when you're paying 4 or 5 times as much as the going rate. But instead, she wasn't actually getting any service at all. She hadn't heard from the provider for many months. When we looked at whether her employees should be employees or contractors, it really was that they should be employees. And by changing them to contractors, merely to save some money on the fees from the bookkeeper, she would be putting herself at risk of being audited from the ATO. Not a good place to be. For those not in Australia, the ATO is the Australian Taxation Office. Clearly not someone you want breathing down your neck. But she also wasn't addressing the problem. The real problem was the bookkeeper, a service provider who wasn't providing a service and was charging a lot to do so. So instead, I obviously suggested to her she contact the service provider, her bookkeeper, and have a discussion with them about the service and the cost, and whether something could be done to bring them more in line, given that her business had slowed down due to COVID. She did not have a requirement for as many bookkeeping services, as many hours, so surely the cost could be cut back, particularly if she maybe did some of the work in-house herself. Now, if they weren't going to come to the party, then at that time you would investigate replacing the bookkeeper with another bookkeeper, or potentially bringing those services back in-house. Now remember, alternatively, the change may have come about through the opposite of the business shrinking. The business could have been growing. Often we outsource tasks early on, things like bookkeeping, but as we grow, it is something we potentially bring back in-house, and we have an in-house accounts person that would look after all that sort of thing. So do consider where your business is at and whether things have changed, and that may necessitate a change to your service provider or to your supplier relationships. In another example, the provider was not responding to contact, and she wasn't doing the work she'd been asked to do, including simple tasks that on the face of it should really have taken 5 minutes to do maximum. However, eventually the client did manage to connect with her service provider, and she found out that there had been some sort of issue in the setup of the original business, and therefore there was a complication that was going to take some time to resolve, which now had been, and therefore what was meant to be a 5-minute task would now become a 5-minute task after these hours of fix-ups had occurred. The process to remove or change a service provider is typically quite straightforward. However, we know that there's a factor here that we need to address first, and this is honestly why many of you haven't dealt with problem service providers. It's because humans are involved. People are involved on both sides of the transaction. You are a human, the supplier or the service provider is a human as well. Neither of you may be ready to give up the business relationship. You might be over it, they may be over it, neither of you may be over it. But if somebody's not willing to give up that relationship, just like a normal personal relationship, it can make it difficult to end that relationship with that service provider or that supplier. Sometimes I hear, but they're a nice person, I really like them. Well, they may be, but be friends with them instead. Don't have them as your service provider or your supplier if they can't fulfill the need. Service provider or supplier decisions should be based on hard facts and what is right for your business, not just on whether someone is a nice person. Sure, that should come into it as well though, because if someone's really unpleasant to deal with, we aren't really going to want to continue dealing with that person. However, there is a difference between being nice and being a good person. You've probably heard the saying, nice people finish last. And I think in business, this does happen a bit. So don't be nice at the expense of your business, your customers, your mental health, and your happiness. Instead, be good. Go about things the correct way, do the right thing, communicate, and you are doing good. You're doing the right thing, but it is still ultimately leading to the termination of that service provider or that supplier. So when things aren't working, how do you actually go about it? How do you go and deal with this with the supplier? First of all, do you actually have a problem? You may perceive there is a problem when there may not actually be one. So like anything, it's probably best to give the benefit of the doubt first up and ask the question first before jumping in on some crusade, all excited, and there's not actually anything wrong. The service provider or the supplier may not even be aware of your need. Maybe they didn't get your email, and that's happening a lot lately due to overzealous spam filters. One of my many email addresses even puts .gov.au addresses constantly in the spam, which is very frustrating. So there's no hope for small business. Also, we're human. Sometimes we get busy. Sometimes we forget to respond. Or we may have thought we responded because we typed up the message, but we never actually hit send. And this can be a problem, like for me, when I work late at night, I know that I've typed up the message to the person, but if I go to bed but leave the computer on or not logged off overnight, come back in the morning and it's done some sort of log off or reboot, I might come back in the morning and not realize that I haven't sent that message when I hadn't. That can be really frustrating. Whereas it's great in my Gmail emails because I can just go schedule send 8 a.m. in the morning. Perfect. But sometimes we don't want to send messages to let people know that we're working at 2 o'clock in the morning. Have you lost trust for your service provider or your supplier? If you have lost trust, it's a bit like any other relationship. It can be a hard one to come back from. Do consider whether you can come back from the breach of trust and whether the issue is actually worth repairing. Discuss your issues with that service provider. There is no point keeping things to yourself and just getting yourself more boiled up and more frustrated. The service provider or supplier may easily be able to rectify your problem, or adjust the way they interact with you to make the relationship work better and more effectively. Particularly if you have been working with a person for a while, or if you think they're a good person, then give them a chance to change the way that they are working with you. If the service provider is unable or unwilling to change, or don't acknowledge there's an issue, then the next step is to look to move to another provider. With a supplier, it may be a similar process, but it may be even more obvious because things like quality control may have been slipping, and you may be able to clearly demonstrate an issue with quality control. Whereas sometimes with a service provider that's providing, say, for instance, coaching, it can be a little bit more difficult to pinpoint where the issue actually is. Sometimes it's not really quantifiable. It's more of a gut instinct that something's just not working right. So the first step may be, after talking to the provider and seeing whether anything can be resolved, is to investigate other providers. There's no point terminating your current provider if you have no backup plan, or if you don't know how they actually compare to the market currently. For instance, you may think your web designer maintenance plan is really expensive until you realize that actually they're quite cheap in comparison to others on the market currently. So then it may be a case of going back to the first provider and just agreeing maybe a lesser service. Maybe you could do some of the work yourself rather than terminating them. If you do now determine you do need to leave this relationship, you do need to terminate the service agreement or the supplier relationship, then make sure you go back to your agreement. See if there's any clauses about termination and whether notice needs to be given. So if you work out that there are definitely better alternatives out there, then take a step further and actually make sure that one of these providers would be a good fit for you by doing your due diligence and meeting with them and agreeing terms and how they would actually physically take over. You don't want to end up with another problem because you didn't take the time to thoroughly test them out in advance. Thoroughly read and, if necessary, get a lawyer to check their agreement or the new contract, especially if it's for something like production or manufacturing of a custom-made item. Make sure you complete a project plan for the transition. For instance, will templates be needed to be transferred from the existing manufacturer to the new one? Will you need to provide any background information? What sort of things will you need to get to the new one most effectively? Once you have the new provider set up and ready to go in the background, terminate your existing contract. Give the notice that you are required to give. You should not need to go into the reasons for your termination at this stage because remember you already discussed them earlier. At this stage, things could be handled professionally by the other party, or they could start throwing their toys or making your life very difficult. From your end, you can control your behavior, obviously. So remain professional at all times. You never know when that person may reappear. And also, we want to be a good human. Treat others as we want to be treated ourselves. After the transition to the new provider, continue to monitor the new provider's service and make sure you have a check-in with them in a suitable time frame after starting. So depending on the frequency of the service or the supply, that may be in a week, a fortnight, a month, or even 3 months down the track. Remember, being nice may not work for you and your business. However, still be good. Do the right thing. So in summary, as a bit of a checklist, and this will be available through a download on our blog, is there actually a problem? Speak to them before doing anything else. As long as trust has not been eroded, speak to them and see if you can negotiate some changes once they're aware of your concerns. Be prepared to adjust the scope, quality, and/or time if you want to seek a reduction in cost. Investigate other service providers to replace the one you want to end the relationship with. Maybe you need to renegotiate existing services instead. If you determine termination is the way to go, Check your service agreement to make sure you know the notice required and the actions to take to terminate the agreement or the contract. Do your due diligence before choosing your new provider. Make sure to check any agreement or contract for any add-ons and all that sort of stuff, and know the handover process, especially where manufacturing is involved of a custom product for you. Alternatively, you may be taking back in-house to yourself or to a new employee, for instance, an accounts person, so consider how that handover would work as well. Give your termination notice to your existing provider and, as allowed, transition to your new provider. Monitor the new provider and have a check-in with a suitable time frame to assess how things are working. Remember, make the right decision for your business or be friends with them instead. I hope this has been useful. Thanks again for tuning into the FAQ Business Podcast. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the FAQ Business Podcast. Available on all good podcast services. You can subscribe today via faqbusinesspodcast.com.au or directly on Apple iTunes, iHeartRadio, or Spotify. Subscribe, follow, share, and where able, review our podcast or leave us a comment on either YouTube or our blog page. Thanks for helping us to help you, the small to medium businesses who are growing and want to make a difference. Look forward to connecting with you again on the next episode of the FAQ Business Podcast.